Hey YouTube, this is Tony and I am finally back with an update on the G-System Sinanju, this time tackling the lower half of the body. This is just all from a single page, as you can see here. Obviously there are going to be two legs, so there's a left and a right, and this is the number of parts that you actually get out of it. Quite a stack. So it's taken me a good few weeks just to first of all find all the pieces. Remember, they all come in little bags, they're not explicitly numbered. So it's going through the parts, trying to find everything that it's required, and then going on a massive mission of cleanup. So overall the parts were pretty good. There were quite a few large sprues, so as you can see here, quite a large chunk had to come off. I think this was maybe about 2 or 3 millimeters thick. I needed to haul out a proper woodwork file to actually get through this. Otherwise, relatively good. There was only one problem on this part here, which I needed to do a little bit of filling, and overall the fit is pretty good. One exception being, this side here, they all seem to be somewhat unique. So what I ended up having to do was label them differently and get them to fit. So for example, you can see here the fit isn't quite perfect. You can see a few gaps, but I did that with the 4 different pieces. That's for the left and the right leg, just getting them to fit nicely. So it's not perfect. As you can see here, the gap is a little bit bigger down that side, but again, this is a hand sculpted kit, so I'm not going to get too bogged down in getting it perfect. But yes, so now it's up for priming and painting, and I'll give a few in-progress shots as I move along. Since there's so many parts, I'm going to be doing this a couple of steps at a time, so I'm just starting with steps 8 and 9. So what you can see here, I've done a base coat of white, and then a dark red pre-shade on the parts that are going to be red. And then for the black parts, these are predominantly black, just in the center, and I've left the edges to be highlights. So what I'll be doing for the remainder of this video is, rather than just showing you the completed parts, I'll be doing a little bit of airbrushing as I go, just showing you a bit of progress. Stay tuned. Okay, now that I've finished doing a first coat of the primary color on top of the pre-shade, I can go in there and start focusing on doing a few more highlights and just tidying things up. If you remember from one of my previous videos, I've shown that it doesn't really matter if your pre-shade is tidy or not, because when you're applying your primary color, that's when you can start tidying things up. So what I'll be doing is going in with a little bit more fine detail in these areas, just doing a spot highlight just along those areas between the panel lines and the edges. Okay, so as you can see here, it's starting to tidy up a little bit better. I hope you could see what I was doing on camera there. Just adding a few more highlights. And generally just able to do this by looking at where it's a little bit wet. It's quite hard to tell, especially on camera, but that's already starting to show a little bit more definition. This is now dried completely, and you can see now that shininess is gone. What also happens is, as it dries, it becomes a little brighter, so when the paint is obviously wet, the tone is a bit darker, so it can actually give the impression that there is still a lot of pre-shade, so that is something to watch out for. So now I'm just going to continue with the top coat, or the primary color, and just try and hide some of that pre-shade a little bit more so that it's only ever so slightly coming through. Okay, so that's pretty much as far as I want to take it. It's looking a lot shinier when I look through the screen, so it's obviously a little bit wet still, so I'm going to let that dry. What I'm seeing if I don't look through the screen is I can still see, some dark areas along the edges, just that very subtle pre-shade coming through, and that's as far as I want to take it. I do want to see some of the pre-shade, but obviously don't want to see it in a noticeable way, and I'm just going to continue doing that with all the parts. Here's a side-by-side comparison of a part that I did before. So this is from the torso. Don't know if you remember from my previous video. As you can see, it's looking a lot darker by comparison, and the only real difference here is that this one has a gloss coat applied initially, and then I applied a matte coat thereafter, and it obviously has the washes. And you can see how that's actually changed the color. So the color ratios were exactly the same. So for the pre-shade, it was 20 parts red, 1 part black. And then for the top red, or the primary color, that was just the Vallejo, Ferrari red, without any white or black added to it. So it's quite interesting to see how different the color actually comes out once you start applying the gloss coat. So I'm going to do the gloss coat now, and we will see how that looks. Okay, so remember the idea here is we want to spray wet to try and give it that glossy finish. So obviously, yes, it's gloss coat, but if you don't spray it wet, it ends up having a textured surface. So, what you can see here is that that's looking quite nice and shiny and wet. There are a few little dimples and things like that, but I found in the past that these will, once dry, will smooth out and level out quite nicely. So that's already looking a lot darker. We'll see how that compares in a minute. I left the gloss coat to cure overnight, so that is looking nice and smooth. Very nice surface for applying washes, and also by letting it cure, that means that there's less risk of that top coat coming off when I start removing any of the mineral spirits or doing any sort of cleanup. For my washes, I'm going to be using enamel paints, so I'm going to be mixing that with a little bit of white. I don't want my enamel to be completely black, so just ever so slightly off black. Otherwise it looks a little bit too cartoony in my opinion. So just going to make that a nice dark grey. And I'm mixing that with Artist's Mineral Spirit, or White Spirit. I decided to use this instead of lighter fluid. Lighter fluid obviously is very volatile, it dries nice and quickly, but because I have so many parts that I want to do in one sitting, I'm going to use something a little bit softer so that it doesn't dry too quickly. Because once that enamel has dried, it is really stubborn to remove. So making this nice and watery, if you will. So maybe about 10% enamel, 90% spirits. So thinking of it just as a dirty spirit. And that will just allow it to flow really nice and easily. And that's quite a good color I've got going there as well. So as you can see, very liquid, nice and smooth as well, thanks to the Revell enamel. So I filled the second basin just with clear mineral spirits, and that'll help with the flow, so I'll just apply that initially where I want the enamel wash to go. Just pushing that into the panel lines. And then with my second brush, just allow that to flow in. There you can see some of the capillary action happening there. It doesn't usually end up at any sort of perfect line, but just by applying that initial coat, that just helps a little. Okay, that one is now done. Obviously looking a little bit messy, but that's okay. Once that starts drying, I'll just go in there with a cotton swab and just clean that up. And another 20 parts to go. Here's the cleanup going on. Just got a damp cloth, damped very, very slightly with the same mineral spirits, and just going in the opposite direction of the panel lines, just to clean them all up. Doesn't have to be perfect. And once that's dry, I'll just brush that off to make sure that there's nothing stuck to it. Sometimes you get some fluff stuck in the enamel paint. Yeah. There we go, just bringing out that detail quite nicely. I was just about to start putting on the decals, and I noticed that I'd actually painted something wrong. This here is actually supposed to be black with the metallic trim. So I'm just going to use some silly putty here and just mask the bottom off. Like so. Obviously try and get that down as much as possible. It's a bit of cling film, so I don't have to cover the whole part with silly putty. Okay, it's finally time to do the decals. So I'm just going to soak that in water for a bit. I also like to use the decal medium from Vallejo. This is a softener, and that'll also help the decals stick to that surface a little bit better. I just need to apply a few drops and just brush that where I'm going to be placing the decal. There we go, moving around nicely. I'll just slide that into place. And then if you're not happy with that, while it's still a little bit wet, you can still dab that around just to add a little bit of water, but that's looking fine to me. Okay, so all the decals have been applied. This is just a sampling of all the different decals I've had to apply. I mean, that is quite a stack. So that took a good few hours, as you can imagine. So interestingly, for the first time, I tried using this acrylic gloss varnish, so rather than airbrushing it, I've got this aerosol can, also Vallejo, and it went on really well, nice and easy. But what I found is that as soon as I put water on it, so for example, because these are water slide decals, it really started messing up the surface. As you can see there, it just turned that glossy surface into a matte surface, which is quite surprising. So it's looking a little discolored. I'm hoping that's just because it's matte. Same again, when I was applying the different decal mediums. So for example, you get the decal medium and the decal fix from Vallejo. That also left a few marks, as you can see there, particularly on the black. If I show you this piece here, you can see it's looking in pretty bad shape. And I'm really hoping that that all-forgiving matte finish is going to hide all of that. So let's give it a go. So I like to make my own satin finish or matte finish. I find if I use a pure matte, I find it gets a little chalky. So what I actually do is take 75% gloss, mix that with 25% matte, and that'll give me a finish that I quite like. It's 15 drops, 5 drops, add some airbrush medium, and then stir that all up. Then I'll tip that out into the airbrush. So when I apply my matte finish or my flat finish, I do it very light, and I don't spray wet like I would the gloss coat. You can see how the decals are really nicely blended in now, and you can't see any of those marks, which is great. So next up are the inner frame components. I've obviously already painted up the full pre-assembled inner frame, but there are also a few components that are done with resin for some reason or other. So I've already painted these in black. This is done using FW acrylic ink. So it's not actually as black as I would like it to be, but I think that should do. So what I'm going to then use is the Vallejo Model Air, what is this, gunmetal black, or Negro Metallo. So I'm going to use that, and we'll see how that comes out. I'm not going to bother doing any sort of hand painting. There's a lot of pipe work and stuff in there. I don't really know why they've gone to those lengths, because that bolts straight onto the frame and goes flush. You will never see any of that detail, so I'm not quite sure why they wasted their time doing it. A lot of the stuff even here, that's all going to be hidden, but I guess some of those edges might be caught or might be visible, so I'm just going to make sure that those are painted correctly, and hopefully that will be enough. I'm not going to paint individual pipes or anything to that effect. Again, you're not going to be able to see this stuff unless you're looking really close, and you could spend months and months just doing that kind of stuff, and I'm not going to bother. Looking at the inner frame, there are just a couple of pieces that need to change for the legs. So if I look at the instructions here, you can see it's this part over there on the knee, and then also the actual foot. So you have to take that inner frame that's already pre-assembled, and you have to take the feet off, or at least just the front part, and replace it with this section here. So this is what originally was. You can see it's a lot larger, and inside there was also like a little plastic section that just filled that gap so that these bolts can go through. And that was quite problematic, because on this particular foot I managed to strip the thread. I ended up having to drill all of that out and actually then use pliers to unscrew that, because you end up using a very, very fine Allen key, just a 1.5 mil, and as you can imagine, that stripped quite quickly. I'm at a very exciting point right now to assemble the legs. It's taken quite a few months, as you've obviously seen from the delay in this video, so really excited to be doing this. So I mentioned before that some of the inner frame parts have to be replaced by resin parts. So here's an example of the knee that basically had to come out of there, had to disassemble some pieces, and this is then the resin component equivalent with a slightly different slot for the kneecap. So putting it together is not terribly straightforward. So again, being resin, these little parts here, relatively flat, have warped a little. I should probably have tried to straighten them more with a hairdryer before I actually started painting. I ended up filing and things like that, thinking that would be adequate, but as I can see here, they are slightly misaligned. So there is a bit of play, which is fortunate, but you can see also over here that these aren't necessarily lining up very straight. So this kneecap inside is supposed to line up with that, and fortunately they've actually quite cleverly covered it up so you don't actually see the join. So to do that, you really have to bend the knee. It's a double jointed knee. You've got to bend that back and pop that into that slot over here. So that fits in like that, and then you can bend this lower part of the knee back up. Let's see if I can do that. And there you go. So that then now fits in, and you can't see that they aren't actually connected. So if I turn that around the other side, the same as over there. And that's how he stands. The thrusters are quite interesting, so I just thought I'd show a little bit on that. So this is the leg, obviously. This goes on the outside. And underneath here, you actually got 3 thrusters that are going to go in there. So once assembled, they just look like that, and they just pop in quite nicely. What's interesting about them is that they are completely metal. So there are 3 parts here, so I guess this is some sort of aluminium or dyed aluminium, not 100% sure. And what happens then is you've got this brass pin, so also this is metal, it's brass, that pops in there. And then also they have just this little finishing guy as well. So these went around the waist, we have several of these, and that just pops in there. So what I'll be doing is just using a bit of super glue to glue that together. But anyway, I thought that was quite interesting because it's all metal. I don't really understand why they've made that metal. Obviously you could have airbrushed that if it was plastic. That would reduce the weight and cost of the kit. But that's how it is, and there are quite a few of them. So as you can imagine, there are 3 on each leg on this side, 2 as well at the rear of the leg. So there's, again, this fits in the back there. So yeah, pretty cool. Unsurprisingly, there's obviously a bit of a trick to putting this all together. You can't just stick them on in any order because there is a bit of overlap and some of the pieces slot into each other as well. So it starts off, I've done a few dry builds just as a practice. I'm going to be using a 2-part epoxy glue or resin, so I definitely want to make sure I get this right before it sets. What I've also had to do is just clip off a few pieces on the side here from the inner frame, just so that everything would fit. These were getting in the way. There were little slots which I guess different kits might fit into. So I first start by putting these 2 together, and then this guy here also slots into the back. So if you look over here, there's a little key there. So I've got to put those on. So let me mix up some glue and I'll continue in a bit. Just going to start putting a little bit of glue into the key here. I don't want to put it on the part because I might accidentally touch another part of the model as I'm putting it in. So I can apply this quite generously because there's quite a lot of play in there. So this will make sure that it sits in securely. So this is the left leg, which has this extra section down the side. You'll notice I've just used a bit of tape there. It all kind of slots in. I didn't want to glue that in because it needs a little bit of flexibility when putting it on. And you'll see in a moment that once it's all on, you cannot see the inside of this at all. So it is quite surprising that there's so much detail on the inner side here, because that gets covered up completely. And then this piece there needs to slot in. and then these two pieces go together. And I undoubtedly will be fumbling a bit. Make sure that's in. Okay, so it's obviously a little bit clumsy. Same again on the other side. Doesn't have to be perfect, because again, that's just going to all get covered up. So you'll notice with this frame, I haven't actually bothered doing any pre-washes or anything to that effect, because that just all gets covered up. I learned the hard way with my perfect grade that nothing actually is visible, so I didn't want to waste my time. It already took me long enough to do all of this. Let's pull that knee back for the next piece and get that on there. Now what's going on here? Okay, so as you saw, quite a lot of play. You can see there's no play over there. This little section is glued on, and the heel wants to flick back all the time, and I really want that as far forward as possible so that the guy can rest there. These, as you can see there, look how much play there is. They really aren't aligned at all. And I have a feeling it has to do with this piece there. Yeah, so this here you can see is warping as I pull it back. Okay. Now this one, I actually don't think I'm going to glue. That just slots into that key there. And the reason why I want a little bit of play is because this ankle I wanted to move, and I noticed on the last leg I glued, see, as you can see there, I don't want to glue it in place until I have it actually posed, but it's kind of tricky because you have to get this piece in before you get the kneecap in, because that completely covers it up. So these guys have to go in as well. I'm not going to glue those. The other one's already in there still. And I noticed with this guy, it's actually quite a tight fit and you don't need glue. So I'm going to see what that looks like. And that's squeezed in. The crunch sounds always make me nervous. But that's in, these guys are still in there, and there it is. So a little bit of play. Remember, this is handmade, also then cast by hand, so understandably these resin pieces will have gaps, so you can see there, depending, you can kind of have it one way or the other. Either it's flush there, or it's flush there, but it doesn't seem like you can really have both. But I'm going to leave those unglued, so that if I do want to make any adjustments I can. I'm just going to keep holding that for a few minutes until the epoxy is set. The upper leg has a really nice fit. It doesn't actually require any epoxy, I just used a tiny bit of super glue. Really nice fit. What is interesting with the frame is that even though it's so posable and has all these double joints, being the Sinanju, maybe a lot with the other kits as well, there's so much armour, it just gets in the way that you can't really pose the Sinanju as you would like him. So for example, if you try to bend his leg like that, you obviously end up closing that gap, and what you'll find is then that doesn't actually fit. So obviously it's like right in the way of that component there. So what I'm having to do is really straighten everything up. And I guess this is why you only ever see the Sinanju in a standing up pose. You can't really do anything dynamic with him like you can the Astray red frame, for example. So once I've done that, you can see that now fits in nicely. And same again with the other side. And I'm just going to use a bit of super glue to put those together. And I'm going to do that off camera because I need to see a little bit better. Now the upper leg has some severe distortions. This is on both legs, and that has to do with these like thigh or quad armour over there. So that looks really good on that side. I've glued the front so that looks good. But if I were to turn that around, you'll see the massive gap over there. I mean, that is enormous. So it looks like, if I turn it around, this here already, you know, it's kind of compounded. This one is bent outwards. This one's also bent outwards, and it just compounds that way. Now, whether or not you can fix this up, you might be able to get away with it with a hairdryer. You know, I found before with the hairdryer you have to apply a lot of heat. I didn't want to risk actually snapping the part or anything to that effect, so I decided to leave it alone. And in the end, as I mentioned before, because this is quite a rigid posture, I'm going to be displaying it so that it is facing forward in my display case. So what I'll just be doing is probably lining it up so that it looks good on one side. But ultimately it's really just the front that you need. So I haven't actually glued that. I've left that a little bit of play so that once I've finally posed it, I can adjust this if need be. And remember, now I'm going to attach the upper body, and it has all of these large skirts, if you remember. And that's going to occlude a lot of the suit anyway. So it's got those pieces in the front, these pieces on the side, and I'm hoping that that will just hide all of that completely anyway. And finally, after several months of effort, the legs are assembled and attached to the upper body. Obviously it looks quite bottom heavy at the moment because the shoulders and the arms haven't been done yet. That will be the next part of the project. He was quite difficult to pose in the end. I've got a slight stance going on there, but your movement is really limited. And also just trying to get him to balance is quite tough. If you can look there at the back of his legs or his heels, they're not actually touching the ground. They're spring-loaded. I couldn't get them to stay down. I was hoping they would offer some sort of support. But if you do get them all the way down, he ends up tilting or teetering backwards and obviously looks a bit daft. But that's the posture. I'm going to keep him for now. I might change that later once the arms are on. But really cool to see that all that skirt arm is covering quite a lot. I mentioned in the previous snippet that I had problems with the upper legs in terms of that armour not closing completely at the back, but as you can see there, the way that I've got him posed, you obviously cannot see the back and you wouldn't know any better. I'll just do a full rotation so you can see what he's looking like. I'm bringing him closer to the camera as I rotate. I've just found if I leave him on the platform, he's easier to move around. He was quite difficult to pose. Lighting conditions could be a bit better. It is really overcast today. So it is such a shame that there's a big section of work that went on under there and that all got covered by that big booster. Oh well. Quite a lot of the inner frame exposed there, looking pretty cool. So I haven't actually done any weathering on that, but I probably will do a little bit of washing. And I probably also will come back and do a few dry brushing. So I did that with the upper body. I did some dry brushing with some metallic and some red, as well as some black, just to make it look a little bit more weathered. And there you go. Thanks again for watching. I hope that you learned something. Please do remember, if you liked what you saw and you're enjoying what I'm working on, please do give the video a like and subscribe to my channel. See you in a couple of months.